There's no question that life was simpler back then, but simple doesn't always mean better, and people lived without a lot of the things that we now take for granted.
This was back in the 40s, I guess. I'm trying to think back when the WPA program was formed, and this again came out of the Depression because there wasn't any jobs, and this was to create jobs. And Paul Westhoff, who was the mayor of O'Fallon at the time, had the foresight to put in for the grant to get the WPA in the town of O'Fallon to put in our first sewers. There was no sewers in O'Fallon. There was all, at that time, nothing but outhouses. And I can remember on Main Street, my grandmother lived on Main Street, and we went to visit Grandma, and they were putting the sewers out in front of her house at that time. And I think they were something like 13 feet deep that they had to digging by hand. And at that time, you didn't put any safety walls up or anything like that, because digging by hand, you knew whether the ground was solid, whether it was safe to be down in there. But being down in there in a trench 13 feet deep, filling up a bucket, they'd pull it out one bucket at a time to dig those sewers. And I guess the engineering work was good because, like I say, the sewers are still used today and they have very little problems.
Back then, the city had very few paid employees and equipment was scarce, so change came the hard way with backbreaking work.
Ducky Holmes was almost a famous person. He had an absolute memory of where everything was for infrastructure. And we had one employee that took care of the streets, maybe two, Al Eichholz and Bill Leverett, and they were the street crew. And but Ducky kind of oversaw everything, and he could tell you where the sewer lines were and where the water lines were, and unfortunately all of that wasn't made a record. And if you needed to know, whenever someone came to town and needed to know where to connect to the water, they had to go find Ducky, and he, from memory, could tell them exactly.
With very little money in the city's coffers, Paul Westhoff's vision for modernizing O'Fallon came with a lot of determination.
One of the first people to greet me, I guess, or get acquainted was Paul Westhoff, who was the mayor at that time. And he was a pretty busy fellow, had quite a few ideas about how O'Fallon should progress. It was mainly just how to improve what limited facilities were here. Sewer and water was sporadic. There was no real treatment plant for sewer. They operated what was called a lagoon at that time, which was in kind of the northeast part of the town. And I guess, unfortunately, Mr. Westhoff died basically in office. And after that was a little bit of disruption with how the direction of O'Fallon was going to go. And due to the kind of level-headed fellow by the name of Dave Burkemper took over and seemed to carry on very well.
The city decided to go from one alderman in each ward to two aldermen in each ward. Mr. Kirchhoff and Mr. Samick came to my house one evening and wanted to know if I would consider running for alderman, because I really didn't know a lot of the new residents, but a lot of the older people knew of me anyway. I was then voted as an alderman, and then that very next December is when Mr. Westhoff died of a heart attack right here in City Hall. So then they appointed Mr. Sigmund, who was an alderman, and he wasn't, I don't think it was less than a month when he got seriously ill. So he couldn't go anymore, and so then they appointed Russ Emge as interim mayor until that April. As I say, I probably became mayor by default because nobody else wanted to take it, and so I ran for the unexpired term, and then I ran 2 terms after that.
In time, the pastures and the farmland that lined Highway K would become the fully developed commercial district we know today.
there was farmhouse here and then another farmhouse, and you go until you got to Ann. I don't think maybe there was 6 houses, farmhouses, because his folks lived on K. Their home was on K. And we used to leave there and we'd go to Cotterville to visit my great aunt, great uncle. And the first time we got on K after we moved back here, I thought we was on the wrong road because, I mean, it just floored you when you saw it. You couldn't even go fast. You couldn't even look. It was just so different.